if the biggest threat to the global energy market right now isn't another US airstrike on Iran? What if it is something much more dangerous and much harder to predict? A war of economic attrition. The US is tightening the sanctions noose around Iran. Iran is refusing to give US what it wants. The Strait of Hormuz remains at the center of the confrontation, and neither side wants to make the first move. This creates a dangerous question. What happens if Iran decides that absorbing economic pain is no longer worth it and chooses escalation instead? Because that may be exactly where this crisis is heading. And if it does, the consequences won't be limited to Iran and the US. It could hit energy, shipping, inflation, and ultimately consumers around the world. So let's look at what really is happening. So the first part is about the US's new sanction strategy. Washington has made another move against Iran, but here's the interesting part. Despite the very tough rhetoric, the latest sanctions package is not the economic knockout punch that some headlines might suggest. Instead, the US has dramatically expanded the potential reach of its sanctions regime. 5 additional sectors have been brought into the framework: digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. Now, this matters because it gives the US a much larger pool of potential targets outside Iran itself. In other words, the US isn't simply saying, we're going to sanction Iran. The message now is increasingly, if you continue doing business with Iran, you could become our next target. Now, that is a very different strategy, and it appears designed to make banks, shipping companies, refiners, tech companies, and other third-party businesses think twice before dealing with Tehran. But there is a problem. Many of these sectors have already lived under sanctions for years. Iran has adapted. It has developed alternative trading channels. It has learned how to operate around restrictions and has demonstrated something extremely important. The Iranian regime has a high tolerance for economic pain, so the immediate impact of these latest measures may be considerably smaller than the political rhetoric surrounding them. This looks less like economic D-Day and more like a warning. The US is saying we can go much further. The question is whether Tehran believes that the US actually will do. The second part is the Chinese problem. There is another country sitting right in the middle of this strategy, and that is China. This is one of the most important parts of the story. Trump has a major diplomatic objective ahead: the planned September summit between him and Chinese President Xi Jinping. The US wants this meeting to happen and has a strong incentive not to do anything that could blow up the broader US-China trade relationship. This creates a very important constraint on Iran's policy. The US can impose additional sanctions on smaller Chinese entities, like smaller refineries, smaller shipping companies, individuals, but there is a line that the US is unlikely to cross, and that line is the direct targeting of one of China's major banks. Because if the US were to hit a major Chinese financial institution, the consequences could be enormous. Beijing will retaliate. The September summit could be jeopardized, and the fragile trade truce between Washington and Beijing could come under some serious pressure. And there is another potential consequence: rare earths. China has enormous leverage over critical mineral supply chains, so Washington has to make a calculation. How much pressure can it put Iran without simultaneously creating a completely different confrontation with China? Tehran understands this. This is what makes the situation so interesting. Iran doesn't need to defeat the US economically. It simply needs to survive long enough for the US's competing priorities to become a constraint. Let's move to the UAE. And this is even more important, particularly for Dubai. For years, Dubai has been a major conduit for Iranian commercial and financial activity. According to US Treasury data, the UAE and Dubai in particular accounted for approximately 71% of Iran's global shadow banking activity and received about 62% of Iranian funds moving globally. Those are enormous numbers, and the US knows it. The latest sanction strategy, therefore, isn't only about squeezing Tehran directly. It's also about closing the channels through which Iran can continue operating, and the UAE appears to be responding. On the 19th of August, the UAE announced that it would freeze commercial and financial transactions with Iran until further notice. But there is an interesting dynamic here. Dubai has historically played a much larger role in facilitating Iranian banking activity. Abu Dhabi, meanwhile, has previously pushed for tighter restrictions on Iranian access. So the US may now have a powerful lever. It doesn't necessarily need to sanction every Dubai-based entity. It can use its broader relationship with the UAE to encourage the Emiratis to close those channels. For Tehran, that creates another problem. The financial system is being squeezed, the trading channels are being squeezed, and sanctions are expanding. But Iran still hasn't given the US what it wants. And that brings us to the most important issue of all, the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the entire confrontation comes together. The US wants the strait reopened, Iran wants sanction relief, and both sides have a very different idea about what needs to happen first. The US has offered to end the oil blockade in exchange for Iran stopping disruptions to tanker traffic through the strait. Tehran has rejected that sequencing. Instead, Iran is holding to the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding. Under that framework, Iran wants the US to end the blockade, release frozen Iranian funds, and provide sanctions relief, including relief affecting petroleum and financial services. And in return, Iran would work towards fully reopening the strait. But there is a problem. Who moves first? The US doesn't want to give Iran concessions before the Hormuz is fully reopened. Iran doesn't want to reopen the Hormuz before receiving meaningful concessions from the US. Neither side wants to surrender its leverage. And this is not a minor technical disagreement. This sequencing problem has already helped derail implementation of the broader understanding. And unless the US and Iran agree on how reciprocal concessions are going to be staged, the same problem remains. So what we have is a standoff. The US says, reopen Hormuz first. Iran says, end the blockade and provide relief first. And neither side wants to blink first. So what is it really dangerous possibility? Now we get to the part that I think energy markets should be watching most closely. What happens if the sanctions actually begin to hurt? At first glance, you might assume that increasing economic pressure makes Iranian capitulation more likely. But that isn't necessarily how Tehran will respond. Something suggests we're going to experience something more dangerous. Iran has a higher tolerance for economic pain than Washington. And if the sanctions begin seriously weakening the domestic economy, Tehran would be more likely to return to military engagement rather than simply surrender. Think about what that means. More aggressive tanker attacks in the strait, strikes against regional targets, actions designed to increase the economic and political cost for the US and its allies. In other words, Washington's strategy is based on the assumption that economic pressure eventually produces concessions. But Iran may calculate that economic pressure requires a response, and that response is a military response. This is why the latest sanctions announcement shouldn't necessarily be interpreted as a step towards de-escalation could actually increase the probability of another round of escalation. The logic is brutally simple. If Iran cannot win by absorbing the pressure, it may try to make the pressure more expensive for everyone else. And let's move to Yemen, which is another problem. While all of this is happening between the US and Iran, another potential flashpoint is developing in Yemen. The Houthi rhetoric towards Saudi Arabia has intensified. Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader, has called for stronger action against the Saudi blockade and military build-up. Defense Minister al-Atafi has warned of preemptive strikes against Riyadh. At the same time, there are signs of preparation for potential Saudi-backed ground operations. The key point is that Sana'a increasingly appears to believe that Riyadh is not going to meet its demands. Those demands include issues surrounding port access, Yemeni airspace, and financial arrangements. If that assessment is correct, the probability of renewed large-scale fighting increases. So why should we care, though? Remember, Saudi Arabia's Red Sea export infrastructure exists within an already extremely fragile regional security environment. A renewed Yemeni conflict could therefore add another layer of risk to an energy market already dealing with uncertainty surrounding the Hormuz. So this is not just one crisis, it's potentially several multiple crises interacting with one another. Iran, Hormuz, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the UAE, China, the US. So, what is the US's gamble? Let's step back for a moment. What is Washington actually trying to do? The strategy appears fairly straightforward. Increase economic pressure, expand the sanctions threat, force other countries to isolate Iran, squeeze Iranian financial channels, and maintain pressure around Hormuz, and ultimately bet that Tehran will decide the economic cost is simply too high. But there is a fundamental weakness in that strategy. It assumes that Iran's pain threshold is lower than Washington's, and that is probably not true. Iran has spent decades adapting to sanctions. The regime has demonstrated a willingness to absorb significant economic damage, and Washington has its own constraints: China, global trade, rare earths, regional stability, energy prices, and the political consequences of another military escalation. So the US has leverage, but it's not unlimited leverage because Iran too has leverage. So this is basically a first mover problem. Neither side wants to move first. Iran wants sanctions relief before fully reopening the Hormuz. The US wants Hormuz reopened before providing major concessions, and that creates a deadlock. And deadlocks in geopolitics rarely remain static forever. Eventually, something breaks the equilibrium. The danger is that the thing that breaks it may not be a diplomatic agreement. It could be another tanker attack, another strike, another escalation in Yemen, or another disruption to regional energy infrastructure. And that is why I believe the coming weeks deserve very close attention, because the US is attempting to wedge open the Hormuz to economic pressure while maintaining the blockade and betting that Iran eventually capitulates. But that bet may underestimate Tehran's willingness to absorb economic pain. So what can we conclude from this? Here is a question I want you to think about. What happens if Iran doesn't blink? What happens if Tehran looks at the sanctions, looks at the economic pressure, looks at the tightening financial restrictions and decides, we would rather escalate than surrender our leverage? If that happens, the next stage of this crisis may not be negotiated by Washington. It may not be negotiated by Tehran. It could be decided in the waters and the region surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. And if that happens, the consequences could extend far beyond the Middle East. oil, shipping, inflation, global trade, energy security. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important energy choke points. And right now, Washington and Tehran are playing a very dangerous game of who moves first. The real question isn't whether Washington can increase the pressure, it's whether Iran will absorb that pressure or decide that escalation is the better option. If you think Iran will eventually compromise, let me know why in the comments. If you think Tehran was preparing to escalate, tell me what you think the next move will be. If you want more analysis of what this means for energy and global markets, subscribe, because this story is